just a bit after 10. I'm Margaret Miller. I'm the director of the Institute for Research in Art, which includes Graphic Studio and the Contemporary Art Museum. And I'm delighted this morning to see so many of you here for this colloquium. This is one of several events related to the current exhibition at the Contemporary Art Museum, Trenton Doyle Hancock. We've done all of it's good.
We could.
We've done all we could and none of it's good. I've said that so many times, I don't know why I messed up over it. Curated by our chief curator, David Norr. This morning, I'm really excited about this particular event related to the exhibition because it's brought together members of our faculty community. And we have an interdisciplinary advisory board, or committee really, that meets once each semester, and we make presentations to that group about upcoming exhibitions, and we hope that the themes and content and interests of our exhibition program will be all shared by faculty from across campus so that they utilize the exhibitions more in their classes, and they can participate as respondents or as researchers in helping us advance an understanding of contemporary art practice. So we're very pleased this morning to have Andrew Barish, Assistant Professor in the Department of Humanities and Cultural Studies, Stacy Holman-Jones, Associate Professor in the Department of Communications, and Ira Sukramram, Assistant Professor in the Department of English. And Megan Voeller, a graduate student in our master's degree program in art history, has worked with David Norr to organize this colloquium this morning, and she is going to serve as the moderator. So it's my pleasure to now introduce you to Megan Voeller.
Thank you, Margaret. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on a Friday morning. As a way of beginning this colloquium, I wanted to give you some background on how it came to be and to explain the shape it takes. As Margaret mentioned, I'm an MA student in the School of Art and Art History, and as part of my graduate assistantship, I began working about 6 months ago with Chief Curator David Norr on Trenton Doyle Hancock's solo exhibition at CAM. In conversations with David, as he brought me into the fold of his curatorial work already underway, I learned that one of his primary goals for the exhibition was to open up a space of conversation around Trenton's work different from the way it had been discussed in the past. Previous exhibitions and writing on Trent's work had devoted much time and attention to the elaborate mythology of beacons and mounds that appeared in his paintings, drawings, installations, and performances. This focus on narrative in a literal sense tended to emphasize the way in which Trenton's work illustrated a story at the expense of other aspects of his work. After years of working with Trent, David wanted to tell a different story about Trent's work through the exhibition at CAM and the catalog, which will be published later this year. He entrusted me with conceiving an event, this colloquium, to complement his goal of expanding and enriching the conversation. In dialogue with David, I proposed that we consider narrative in the context of Trenton's work less as a literal story to which the work referred, and more as a quality of his embodied practices of making. This translated to a series of specific propositions: to see Trent's practice, particularly in his sketchbook, as a pursuit and discovery of self-awareness and identity through telling the self. To understand his studio as a site out of which narrative emerges from interactions with and manipulations of materials and rituals of making. And to understand Trent as sampling from and reshaping narratives of pop culture, histories of art practice, and the cultural context of his upbringing. Because David's initial problem had identified a reductive story that was being told about Trent's work, I also wanted the colloquium to be self-reflexive in making apparent our own constructive work of proposing and considering different takes on Trent's practice through conversation. When you want to have a great conversation, you need great conversationalists. For the colloquium narrative practices, we invited 3 interlocutors from across campus to bring their own perspectives, experiences, methodologies, metaphors, analogies, etc., to bear on Trent's work. Gamely, they have agreed. Their presence here today tells us something about the value of a university art museum in the context of a research institution, by which I mean the university broadly. By bringing their own practices into an encounter with Trent's work, by thinking and dwelling with it, our faculty participants have gained new perspective on their own work. I don't think I'm overreaching here. The comments they've made to me in passing affirm that their encounters with Trent's work have yielded new insights into the concepts and methods that inform their own practices. It is my hope that in some small way this colloquium and the generous way in which our faculty participants have embraced Trent's work and responded to it models, particularly for students in our audience today, a process of inquiry that is at the heart of research. Here's how the colloquium works. Before each panelist speaks, Trent and David will talk about several works that are particularly relevant to that faculty member's response to the work. David and Trent's conversation will be brief, on the order of 5 minutes, and then the faculty respondent has 10 or 15 minutes to talk back in whatever format he or she has chosen. Rather than holding all questions from the audience until the end, I'd like to open up to a couple of questions after each respondent speaks. So after Ira's story, after hearing Andy's thoughts, and after Stacy, we'll take a couple of questions for each or for Trent. I will now introduce our participants in the order they'll be speaking. Ira Sukramrum is an assistant professor in the Department of English at USF. Sukramrum is a Chicago-born Thai American. He is the co-editor of What Are You Looking At?, the first fat fiction anthology, and Scoot Over Skinny, the first nonfiction fat nonfiction anthology, both published by Harcourt Brace, and the author of the memoir Talk Thai, The Adventures of Buddhist Boy. Ira has published his essays, poems, and short stories in many literary journals and anthologies, including Creative Nonfiction, the Bellingham Review, North American Review, Isotope, Crab Orchard Review, Post Road, and Tilting the Continent, Southeast Asian American Writing. He has received the New York Foundation for the Arts Nonfiction Fellowship, the Just Desserts Fiction Prize, and an Illinois Arts Council Literary Award. And he has received support from the Blue Mountain Center, Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, and the Writers' Colony at Derry Hollow. At USF, he teaches graduate and undergraduate courses in creative writing. Andrew Barish is an assistant professor in the Department of Humanities and Cultural Studies at USF. His current research focuses on the relationship between musical expression and the social experience of space and place. His book, Lonesome Roads and Streets of Dreams, Race, Place, and Jazz in the 1930s and 40s, which is forthcoming from the University of Chicago Press, examines the ways swing-era jazz represented the geographic and demographic transformations of American life during the Great Depression and Second World War. His research encompasses interests in jazz, American popular music, cultural theories of space and place, and ideologies of race. At USF, he teaches graduate and undergraduate courses in cultural studies. Stacy Holman-Jones is an associate professor in the Department of Communication at USF. Her work focuses on how identities are created, made known, and negotiated through narrative and aesthetic practices. She is the author of Torch Singing, Performing Resistance and Desire from Billie Holiday to Edith Piaf, and has published essays in cultural studies critical methodologies, qualitative inquiry, and text and performance quarterly. At USF, she teaches graduate and undergraduate courses in performance art, performing social resistance, writing for performance, and writing lives. They're joined on stage by David and Trent, whom many of you already know. David Lewis Norr is chief curator for the Institute for Research and Art, which includes the Contemporary Art Museum and Graphic Studio. Since his appointment in 2006, Norr has organized exhibitions and projects with artists Olaf Bruning, Patty Chang, Cameron Gaynor, Joaquin Kester, Roger Palmer, and Allison Schatz. By the way, Roger Palmer is here. Hi, Roger. Recent exhibitions include New Weather, which featured major works by the artists Diana Al-Hadid, Eva Gorgieva, and Robin O'Neill, and Teresita Fernandez Blind Landscape, the first major traveling museum of the recent MacArthur Fellows' work, which traveled to the Bland Museum of Art and is currently on view at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Cleveland. His current exhibition, Trenton Doyle Hancock, We Done All We Could and None of It's Good, a 5-year survey of the internationally recognized artist, will travel to Atlanta as part of the National Black Arts Festival this summer, to the Savannah College of Art and Design next fall, and to the Weatherspoon Museum of Art in Greensboro, North Carolina in the spring of 2012. Upcoming curatorial projects include Stagecraft, DeVille Cohen, Kate Gilmore, and Mary Reed Kelly, which will open this summer at camp. Born in 1974 in Oklahoma City, Trenton Doyle Hancock was raised in Paris, Texas, and received his undergraduate degree from Texas A&M University in Commerce, Texas. He went on to receive an MFA from Tyler School of Art at Temple University, Philadelphia in 2000. Upon graduation, he was granted a core residency at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, and spent 2 years as a fellow in that program. Since 2000, he has lived and worked in Houston. Hancock's recent projects include his commission by the Dallas Cowboys to produce a 108-foot-long, 40-foot-tall mural for the new Dallas Cowboys football stadium. Additionally, Hancock has just completed a residency at the Singapore Tyler Print Institute, where an exhibition of the large-scale works he created during the residency will open this summer. In August 2010, he opened a large public sculpture project at the Olympic Sculpture Park in Seattle. In 2007, he received the Joyce Alexander Wine Artist Prize from the Studio Museum in Harlem. His work has been exhibited in exhibitions nationally and internationally, including the 2000 and 2002 Whitney Biennials. Solo exhibitions of his work have been mounted at the Contemporary Arts Museum Houston, the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth, the Cleveland Museum of Art, and the Museum of Contemporary Art in North Miami. Hancock is represented by James Cohen Gallery in New York and Dun & Brown Contemporary in Dallas. Now, that's Trent's official bio, but I also want to share some unofficial biography with you, if you'll permit me one more moment of your time. Another of the projects I've had the pleasure of working with both David and Trent on is a compilation of interviews with artists, curators, gallerists, and other people Trent has worked with over the years, including Robin O'Neill, who's an artist whose friendship with Trent dates back to more than a decade ago when they shared late-night sessions of watching Seinfeld, eating spaghetti, comparing childhood, and Xeroxing old copies of Art Forum at the campus library. Here's just some of what Robin had to say about Trent. You'll have to read the catalog to find out more. Trent flaunts it only in subversive ways, but he is very possibly the most proficient draftsman alive right now. His ability to draw or paint absolutely anything is astounding to me, even after knowing him for 15 years. But every single piece he's let out into the world, in my opinion, is an example of his unparalleled abilities. The formal qualities of his work are his and his alone. They are bizarre, beautiful, and complicated. Those images are tricky. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our panel.
Thank you, Megan. Megan, I want to thank you for more than just the introduction, but also for your thoughtful diligence in organizing this panel. It's really been a pleasure to work with you on this, and I sincerely appreciate the work because this is what we like. This is what Trent likes. This is what we like at the museum. We want to learn too. So this is the perfect environment for each of us up here, including Trent and myself, to learn more about what we in fact do and what other people do and how those things relate. Trent and I only have about 5 minutes, so I'm going to jump quickly into things. But as Megan said, Trent and I are going to go through a few works and set up a conversation or a dialogue that Ira will then follow up with, and then we'll have questions, and then we'll go through the panel as Megan mentioned. The first thing that I wanted to talk with Trent about is the autobiographical nature of some of his works, and I also want to create a kind of dialogue or a dialectic between two different types of works that I think predominate in Trenton's practice, which are paintings, some of them large scale, that I consider performative and very conscious of art history and of the process itself of painting, and of what it means to make a painting, literally. And another practice, which is about access to the self, that Trenton has been doing for many, 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 many years. Megan mentioned the sketchbooks and the interviews that we've been working on. We're working as part of this book that we're making about the show and beyond. We're working with Trenton's sketchbooks, going all the way back to some of them like just after high school. And what you find in those sketchbooks is an incredibly diligent and disciplined practice that is about exploring Trent's self, his thoughts, his feelings, and often communicating them not only in text, because the sketchbooks, some of them are just completely filled with writing with just a few drawings, but also with a drawing practice that is autobiographical, that is revealing, that is, as I like to think about it now, aggressively vulnerable, to the point that that vulnerability metastasizes into something else beyond just revealing something personal and something sentimental, but becomes something seething and painful, but also sweet and humorous. So, you know, I want to set that up for you, and then I want to ask Trenton, because if you go see the exhibition, you'll be able to see these self-portraits and also his paintings. I want to set this up for Trent and ask you, you know, how comfortable do you feel exhibiting these works, and when did you decide, because I know it's recent, that you've decided, even though you've been making self-portraits for years, since the beginning, when did you decide that it was the right time to consider your self-portraiture practice as part of this other practice of narration and telling a story that's very much outside of yourself?
Okay. Well, I would say that the work that I was doing prior to this body of work, that this is, you know, very specifically about the mirror. I'd say the other work, the characterization, all of that had to do with different aspects of myself as well. But I figured, I think things just came to a head in a certain kind of way where I was sort of tired of dealing with these characters that were kind of like me, or a projection of certain aspects of myself, and just wanted to deal with something that was a little bit more totally about me, or more directly about my own body and the different kinds of tortures or trials and tests that the body has to go through, and especially this idea of elasticity and intake, and just how far can the body be stretched before it is no longer a body anymore. And so those issues right now at this point in time are very interesting to me, and I figured the best way to approach those ideas is through myself, and just testing the limitations pictorially of my body, you know, so treating the canvas literally as a mirror in a way.
With a work like this, Man Don't Work, Don't Eat, this is, the title of it is also personal.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, there's always these parallel trains of thoughts that are happening, whether they be textual, or something about my own history, or an investigation about material, or art history. So this title, Man Don't Work, Don't Eat, came from, it's something that my stepfather used to say over and over again, because it's something his father said to him, and it's about work ethic. And you know, when he would tell me to sweep the garage and I didn't do it, he came home and it wasn't done, that's something he would say, you know, man don't work, don't eat. And I didn't quite understand what it meant at the time, but it's like, oh yeah, you get out of life what you put into it. So there's this kind of, and I took that attitude to the studio, so it just wasn't about this, you know, it's just a way of life. So all these platitudes got translated into attitude, I suppose.
I think it's something else that happens that's different from the paintings, which I often find, and I think we'll talk about later, really engage structure and the insides of the body. As you were saying, you know, this is about the body being stretched, and there's a way that reflects a tradition of like caricature and persona-driven works on, you know, that are drawing based, where you are, you know, creating a skin over something that is identifiable and or mask in some ways, you know, right. Because these aren't necessarily literal versions of you; they are projected versions of you. Or I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit more, that aspect of how the desire to do these, or the fear that might encourage you to make these, you know, builds in you, in your
Okay.
process.
Well, yeah, I like what you said. These being a drape in a way, and like a decorated drape that goes over something else that's actually invisible, like this kind of a structure that, and that I maybe don't exactly know how to talk about because I don't know what it is. But the drape for me is a way to. It's kind of like if there's a ghost in the room, you throw the drape over it and you can make out its form. So these, in a way, for me, are a way to kind of do that. And but even with the older work, I described my entry point into characterization as giving form to intuition. So it's like, okay, I'm intuited to create something that is volumetric and stable. So then I name that and adorn it with fur, and those become the mounds. Or I want to make something that's about the superego, or this impulse to project in this very loud way, and maybe that becomes the superhero torpedo boy. So these two are about kind of giving voice to this very primal thing that I'm feeling, but don't quite know what it is. But yeah.
Well, that's something I want to sort of stretch and just talk about for one more minute, Megan, which is that there's very much a part of this that is, in terms of how you do it, unconscious and natural, because the sketchbook and the pencil as an extension of you is something that you have been very comfortable with for a long time. And I want to set this up as a discipline that is about gaining access to the self for our audience, because the evidence that I have, the stacks of sketchbooks that I have that are filled with things like the recording of your dreams, which has been going on since high school, in detail. You know, we think about our own dreams. Some of us are able to remember them more than others, but it is a discipline to remember them. It takes work over a long period of time, I think, to gain access to that. That's part of the access and the discipline that I think Trent has worked on to gain this clarity of yourself and your vulnerabilities and the ability to put those down there. And what I meant by the both unconscious but also natural state is that I think there's a way that you feel comfortable just going here. In other words, these aren't necessarily meditated. They just happen in the sketchbook automatically, whereas a painting is very deliberative. You have to think. There's a kind of conscious act, whereas I know that you just draw pictures of yourself all the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess that you've articulated the difference between those, I would say more like modestly scaled works in the show, the drawings, things that, you know, I do in the sketchbooks, can work on airplanes, or, you know, wherever I happen to be, a coffee shop, I can just whip that out, and they're almost like notations. It's like a shorthand in a way that then over time I may or may not flesh out, and it becomes something else. So yeah, you're right in the sense that the paintings require a bit of premeditation, in that it's like, okay, here's the goal I have, here's the scale that is, oftentimes the scale of those things is just a bit past what a human can take in with their eye. It's like you have to move physically back and forth to take it all in. So therefore it becomes this different kind of experience, and the body is stretched. My physical body is stretched in the studio in a different kind of way. Therefore, I'm a bit out of the comfort zone when I'm making a painting, which, you know, that's okay. I like to be there sometimes, but the drawings are, yeah, it's a different kind of highway system, I suppose. Like, it's more direct from the brain to the paper. It's just this thing, and I don't have to think about it. And yeah, these are almost stream of conscious. Like, just let the pen start moving, and oh, like that happened. Oh, okay, let's go with that. And
Let's move now to Ira's response to Trent's self-portraits.
Thank you, Pat, for being so generous and letting me respond to your work. And I had an instant connection as soon as I saw these self-portraits. And for weeks, I would go to the museum and just stare at them and see what came up, what drove, what was percolating in my mind, stories, memories. And I think talking about, the self-portraits, talking about the self, talking about the body, all things that, to me, hit a chord. I spent the last week in Boise. I was doing some readings and some lectures there. And I think it was really good for me to go to Boise as I was working on this paper, because Florida is flat. And once you're around this flatness, it's hard to think in any other way. When I was in Boise, I started, feeling the undulations of the land. And to me, the first landscape we explore actually is our bodies. We feel it out, we test it out, then we start feeling others, right? So I started writing these little vignettes in response. Megan was kind enough to send me some of the self-portraits so I could stare at them on my computer and respond to them. And so what I did here was just little short vignettes of what I saw, right? And the title of the piece is called, there's 3 titles, On Trenton Doyle Hancock Self-Portraits, or Two Fat Men Meet and Bump Bellies, or Shut Up, I'm Eating. The first self-portrait is Mr. Mouth. You eat, that's what you do. When asked what your occupation is, you do not say writer or artist. You do not say educator. You say, I am a professional eater. You say, I am in the business of devouring. Sometimes you don't know what goes in. Most of the time you don't. A professional eater is not a food critic. He does not analyze food. He does not register taste. He is continuous action. He is the mouth without thought. A professional eater is akin to the professional athlete. Eating is simply the movement of the jaw, the act of consuming, of shoveling in. The mouth is strangely elastic. Open it as wide as you can. Feel the strain at the corners. Feel the jaw at the point of unhinging. Have you seen the skinny Japanese put away hot dogs on the 4th of July? Or the YouTube video of the man shoving ping pong ball after ping pong ball into the mouth? It does not matter what clings to your facial hair, what pokes and prods at your bulbous cheeks. In the end, the mouth can devour anything and everything. There's more.
I think there are several, so maybe we can hear all of them then.
No, this is the self-portrait. No, I really do love myself. We dissect the body. We do this with ease. Go ask a stranger what they love about their body, and he or she will give you a story. We say, I love my legs. We say, look at how toned my arms are. I used to have a friend who walked around school flexing his forearms. A thick vein meandered down to his elbow. Check this shit out, he'd say, and then flex like he was Mr. Universe. We are endless with parts we love and don't love. We cleave the body, dissect it with surgical precision, denigrate parts into pro and con piles. Parts everywhere, lips, eyes, chin, fingers, toes, breast, chest, ass. Well, what if everything is a con? What if there's nothing you like about yourself? What if you've been so critical about your body, scrutinized under your personal microscope, so critical of your life that there's nothing to like at all, not one hair, not one toenail? Then you become without shape. Then you become unmolded clay. Then you cease to have function. Body is nothing without its parts. Sometimes we can't have the things we want. I want. In Old Norse, vante means to lack. This desire to want has been coded into our DNA. We are found always wanting. We are found always needing. When I was younger, I wanted and needed a lot of things. And because my Thai parents spoiled their only child rotten, I got what I wanted and needed. Want, however, can be misleading. Want can take us on the wrong path. I wanted my father's minivan and got his minivan before he left. What I really wanted was for him to stay. Famous wants by famous people. Mark Twain. I want to be in Cincinnati. Everything comes there 10 years later. Einstein. I want to know all God's thoughts. Confucius. I want to be everything that is you, deep at the center of your being. Oscar Wilde. I want my food dead. Trenton Doyle Hancock. Fuck, I want that cheeseburger. Ira Sukrungrung. Me too, Trent. Is beautiful in his pinkish glow. Faster. It is aggravating, no, the weight you carry. It is more than the weight of your physical self. It is the metaphorical weight, the fat that clogs the metaphorical heart, the fat that causes you to think in metaphors, as in, your fat is the undulating land of dips and plunges, as in, your fat is tumors clinging desperately to the bony frame, as in, fat is fat is fat. So you join a gym. Heed Wallace Stevens' proclamation in one of his poems you don't remember, fat be gone. And you want fat to be gone, to be sucked up into the sky and cling to the yellow sun. The gym is not filled with fat people. It is filled with life bodies. They're pixies compared to your bulk. You could eat 2 of them and they would fit comfortably in your living room stomach. And these pixies stare, you feel it, wide eyes as you get on the treadmill. And the treadmill stares too. And the treadmill says, you are fat. And the treadmill says, I can't help you. And the treadmill says, everyone is watching. You look forward, you increase your speed. You're walking, but getting nowhere. Doorstop. I've seen many doorstops in my life, real strange ones. A halved bowling ball, for example, a Raggedy Ann doll wedged under the slit of a door, a Little League baseball trophy, cement blocks stolen from the construction site across the street, a taxidermied beaver. My friend used to keep his door open with a mannequin's arm. He wedged the arm under the door, the hand and fingers waving on the other side. This I found most creepy because once I tripped over the hand during a drunken night and thought zombies were coming out of the ground. The hand, however, made me think of the body, and the body made me think of the head, and the head made me think of baseball. Memory does that. It skips and jumps and lands on moments in our lives we have nearly forgotten, like baseball with a mannequin's head, like Tommy W. stealing a head from a department store, and us Chicago boys taking swings at it at the park. Everyone got a shot before it shattered, split right down the middle. Someone said cool, someone said whoa. We gathered around the head like we gathered around a nudie magazine. Only we weren't gawking at naked bodies, but a broken head, bits of shattered plastic and molding. And there was knowledge in that cracked head, and we thought we were peering into a well of wisdom. And for one extended second, we said nothing because we saw power, because we saw the destructiveness of boys. And suddenly, our own heads were open, though our eyes remained shut throughout it all. Self-portrait with tongue. And this is written in the POV of perhaps one of my students. Let me tell you about an assignment some crazy fat creative writing teacher gave me in his nonfiction class. He's fat because he always says he's fat, like Fat Albert announcing himself from miles away. He says on the first day of class, if you'd ever need to find me, ask someone about the crazy fat Asian professor. There's only one of us around. He's crazy because he likes to talk with his hands and stuff. Sometimes his button is undone on his shirt and his belly button is exposed. He's crazy because he makes us do weird assignments. He stands up there with his hip rip-off polo shirt and says, write a self-portrait. I say, how? Crazy teacher says, go get inspired. I say, how do I get inspired? Teacher says, think about yourself in a way you never thought about yourself. I say, how do we think about ourselves in a way we never thought about ourselves? Fat teacher says, try and write. I say, are there examples of written self-portraits? Crazy fat teacher says, create your own example. I say, pretend you're us. How would you write yours? Teach says, look at Trent's self-portrait with tongue. What do you see? I say, a man with a tongue and nipples. Teacher says, what is the story? I say, is that what you want? A story? Teacher says, I want what you want. I want you to dig. How do you view yourself? What image do you project? What image do you keep hiding? We are made of 100 versions of ourselves. Sometimes we are gluttonous globs. Sometimes we are the superhero on top of white tiger. Sometimes we are desire and rage. Sometimes we are buff. Sometimes we exist in a realm no one understands. Excavate that. I say, this isn't going to be easy. Teacher says, it's not meant to be. Thank you.
Before we move on, do we have a couple of questions for Ira?
I will answer anything.
There you go, it's a challenge. Julie.
At what point in your writing career did you decide that you would be the topic of your writing and your weight in that experience?
I think I'm always, I've always been the fat kid, so fat has always been an obsession. I always talk, and I think, looking at Trent's art too, I think we operate by our obsessions, the things that we can't kick out of our brains. You see the same things reoccur from self-portrait to self-portrait. I return to fat, or at least the fat body, often. It's something I'm constantly thinking about. It's something I can't, it's like the admittance of when I said I was fat changed my whole life. And seeing it through that lens now is pretty much trying to understand these issues of the body, these issues of restraint, these issues of bulk and excess. So it's always kind of chiseling out at that exception, pecking at it.
Is there another question here in the second row? Mm-hmm.
Well, being forced to ask something is always a delight. Did you discover anything new about yourself as you were confronted with someone who projected a visual image and you think literally in that digging around? Did you find anything new?
One of the things that I love about this is, about any kind of art form, is this instant connection one can have to it that sometimes you don't, I suddenly felt like I wasn't alone here, and that in many ways when I looked at Trent's work, I felt like, okay, this dude gets me. Even this dude gets it. I understand what he's trying to do here. I understand I see my life in his self-portraits, and that's very enlightening. Those moments are very enlightening to me as an artist and writer. And I also think, that looking at Trent's self-portrait is that the body is malleable. It changes. It could be at once, this bulbous glob, and then you have the self-portrait of buff and breeches, which is this chiseled man, right? And that's the miracle about the body, right? That it doesn't stay in its same form. And I think looking at Trent's work really reminded me of that.
Okay, I think we're going to move on to the next conversation.
Incredible. Thank you so much. Trent and I are going to move on to a shortly longer than 5-minute conversation about improvisation and about structure and construction and about performativity. And we're setting this up with a group of 6 paintings that are actually in the museum right now. So I hope you take everything that you hear here and just bring it right over to the museum and look at the work, and wow, it just explodes for you. There's one thing I want to say is that, and the reason why I said that is because the images don't tell the story of the constructive, structural aspects of this work at all. And the only way to get that is to stand in front of the paintings and see this as a human activity. And you could think about it like seeing the drips of sweat on the canvas, literally, or you can really just think about it as seeing the logic of progression or of deconstruction or of coming apart and reattaching something. And you can think about it like that, really, and I'd like to put that image in your mind when we talk about these works, because they're very much like that. I wonder if you could talk first about how you set up the challenge to make these works.
Well, with this particular body of work, I often do, from one body of work to the next, or even from one painting to the next, I'll, I guess, extrapolate something, or something from one painting will migrate to the next, and it'll be like, you know, following the bouncing ball kind of a thing. Well, these particular paintings, these what I call heads, but they're, you know, it's a very dumbed down form, or dumbed down icon. That plays a small role in some of my other paintings, like it's, you know, an inch tall or even smaller, or it's peeking or hiding behind certain things in the landscape. I wanted to take that out and turn that into a larger character, and do like portraits, if you will, of this form, because I thought within that form it held a lot of there was a lot of different places I could go with it, in terms of this head mimicked the idea of the mounds that I'd been making. It alluded to head. The eyes could become windows. There was lots of opportunity for exploiting different kinds of architecture within that one shape. So I thought, what I'm going to do is take that form and use it as a constant, and make a series of, it actually turned out to be 10 paintings that there was a how would I say, use the form as the constant, and then within that explore all this kind of variety that was in the studio at the time. It's like, okay, here's an idea about text that I want to maybe use in this one little window, and here's the drip pattern. Here's a color combination I'd like to use here, and here's something that I took from 5 or 6 years ago that was a pattern that I had been using a lot, and just start mixing and matching these things. And I wanted to give myself the challenge of, if the form of the painting is the same, how different can I make each painting from, you know, picture to picture, like, and give it its own identity. And that was the jumping off point.
Yeah, I'm always impressed by the discipline and the challenges that you set up for yourself in the studio. It's something and it's evident in this body of work, because they are so different, and they say different things, but they are rooted with the same limitation in the structure that is, it's a very clear example of what we're talking about. There's something else I know about you, which is the impression of your work that I often get, which is that it's a practice that extends beyond each work. You know, like the life of your work is not in each particular work, but it spreads out, and it tracks and repeats and reinvests itself throughout your process in a number of different avenues, and you often revisit things as well. But you are also a musician, and there's this sense of time that I think is in your work that is also very important. You're a percussionist. You grew up playing drums, and time signature, I know, is always something that you're talking about with what you're drumming, which happens everywhere. And I wonder how, if you could talk a little bit about, because we've talked about it in the past, how you think about expanding on that structure of time in the way that your work kind of comes out of your studio. And you know, these paintings particularly are very labored, but they have that sense of labor and time and, you know, difference and variety and improvisation that goes on with that.
Well, it's hard to say when I actually started thinking in the studio in terms of, you know, cadence and beat and just, you know, thinking in terms of time like that. But there was this moment where I think when I started to think that way about I guess the lifespan of, or the potential lifespan of my studio, there was a lot of relief, because if I thought of, okay, from age 22 or whatever to age 80, okay, that's, you know, that's the song that I have to go, and then within that, there's all this variety that I can, you know, so I don't have to get everything done in the first few bars.
Yeah.
I can extend this thing out and answer, you know, be self-referential. I can at some point come back to something I did earlier in the song and comment on that. So, but that's thinking about it on a broad, you know, a wider scale. But that kind of bracketing, you know, happens every day in the studio when I think about just, you know, how a painting is going to relate to a drawing. And so I think in terms of, you know, this is a straight 4/4 kind of a thing right here. People are going to understand this. I understand this. It's very, how would I say, democratic in the way that people are going to come to it, like a strong, just 4/4 signature. But then other times, it's like, I want to get more, you know, Chick Corea about stuff. He lives around here somewhere, doesn't he? And you know, you want to get more fusion about things, and it's like, and not everybody's going to understand what's happening here. This is going to be a little bit more exclusionary, but that's okay. So I give myself license to have those kinds of moments where different kinds of cadences are going on, but it also, going back to the idea of the body and how I relate to the paintings and to different surfaces. You know, sometimes I'm quite violent in the way that I will make a work, and that's, you know, quite possibly more like a, you know, a punk show and a mosh pit kind of an attitude where, you know, people don't need to come into the studio at that point because I'm throwing things around. Someone could get hurt. But then other times, it's, you know, this very delicate kind of a process where I might have some classical going on in the background, and I'm, you know, things are quite lyrical and delicate and, I don't know, soft. And so I allow for that kind of a space. But, you know, for going back to this particular body of work, I wanted that to happen from frame to frame, from picture to picture. This idea that there's a range of emotion that all artists are capable of. And I was just testing myself to see, you know, okay, can I practice what I always preach? Are these things actually in me, and can I get them out and compartmentalize them and make 10 interesting compositions that speak about not only these different kinds of signatures, these different kinds of textures that I'm capable of, but also talk about time in a certain kind of way, because a lot of those works, in a way, is like, you know, Trenton Doyle Hancock's greatest hits. I was going back 10 years and getting patterns that, you know, I started in 2000, 2001, and I was like, okay, I'm going to put that next to something that I just discovered. So there's these moments of different versions of myself speaking to each other within the picture plane, or under the frame. And so that became interesting, and then started ultimately telling me new things about myself.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, thank you. Why don't we hand things over to Andrew Barish at this point?
I teach lots of American courses on American culture, you know, like America in the 1930s and 40s, and I do a lot of music, obviously, but we read literature and watch movies, and it's fun. You can take my classes, it's fun. And what I wanted to talk about, actually, I was set up really beautifully, softball pitch to Dr. Barish. It's funny that this thing about working with forms and, the overall point I wanted to make was that I became interested in music, and improvisational music in particular, and jazz specifically, through a personal connection where I studied improvisation and jazz, and I'm also a drummer, and I first took drum lessons when I was in like 4th grade, and for some insane reason my parents let me do it, and I had a snare drum for years that I just would wail on, and that was awesome, and eventually I was put in the basement, and we got this soundproofing which didn't do anything, and I don't know, my parents still love me, I think. And so I was drawn into music, a personal engagement. But at the same time, music was obviously a big part of my life, and would listen on my Walkman when I was an adolescent to all kinds of music that I'm really embarrassed about now. Quiet Riot, which I thought was really kind of cool. And my realization, what was drawing me into music was it had a kind of immediate effect on me. And in some cases, not an immediate effect, but there was something there that I wanted to explore. And I became obsessed with, like, how does this work? How does this music work? And I mean, I wasn't thinking about this at 12 when I was listening to Quiet Riot or whatever, or progressive rock like Yes or Jethro Tull or something like that. But I was really, it had this effect, and I wanted to know how it worked, and that what sort of drove me ultimately in my academic work. And it became an issue of trying to understand, and music is often mystified. It's hard to penetrate because it has a very elaborate formal language, and I wanted to be like inducted into that priesthood. I wanted to understand that formal language, mainly to understand why it had such an impact on me. And I'm very Catholic in my taste in music, and I find like even the stupidest pop song can have a really profound emotional effect. And so I was like, what is it structurally about this music, like this arrangement of notes and this pattern, this rhythm, these timbres, that could have such an impact? And when I went to see the show, Trenton's show, I tend to see things in those lights. And when I teach, I'm not like my goal is to bridge like the formal stuff of music. And so I'm always really interested in any kind of art and the actual process of making the art, because that's sort of my interest in music. But in kind of bridging the forms, the structures, the disciplines with the emotional impact, with the emotional expression. And like I said, it comes from my own personal experience. Because, in my own work, I write about historical musical forms, but partly why I was drawn to big band music in the 1930s and 40s is because it sounds kind of old to me. It's so layered with nostalgia, but it had that kind of immediate impact for lots of people. And as I do my work and I kind of try to understand it more, I feel like I'm trying to make some progress toward my own personal engagement with that art, to kind of understand these structures and understand the historical moment and try to bridge the two to understand that emotional impact. And that's a kind of lengthy way of trying to get at, I think what Trenton said in like 3 words, form to intuition, which struck me as better than anything I could say. But so there's my academic work studying jazz in the 1930s and 40s, really popular music more generally, and my personal engagement with music as a musician, as a drummer. I mainly play guitar and struggling to play jazz in some sort of coherent and acceptable way. And so in bridging all these two, and so looking at the art, I guess I tend to go from the form to the expression, or I'm sort of always going back and forth, and that's why I was drawn to the images that with these repeating images. And it's funny, the more I looked at it, the more I started thinking of these other things like stuff we've already talked about, bodies and this, like objection and your self-reflection and things like that. But immediately I was drawn to these repeating the heads, the ghost heads, the Pac-Man heads. That's what I thought of, like the ghost in the Pac-Man machine. And so I tend to look at the visual art and through my experience studying music, and so there's certain things in music and musical form and approaches to improvisation that I tend to see reflected in the visual art and the process of making art. So for instance, issues of discipline that Trenton and David were just talking about, improvisation is often in music, but I think you could extend it to other media, is often seen as this sort of spontaneous thing. But I think what you learn is if you try to do any sort of improvisation is that it's often based on some sort of idiom. In music you want to sound like, you can improvise and it could not sound like jazz, and then you're not, you won't be accepted by other jazz players. So there's a real kind of discipline in learning the forms and structures that you want to play music on. But the irony, the paradox is, of course, is you have to be so disciplined to get to some sort of idiosyncratic personal expression. And that's one of the games. That's one of the excitements and one of the challenges. And see, that's sort of how when I first saw the paintings, that's the kind of thing that jumped to my mind. Is like, oh, I understand, I sort of get this, It's like these heads, and sometimes it's like the veins in the eyes are contained in the eyeballs, and sometimes they're like shooting out of the heads, and the black and the pink and the colors kind of switch, and I get this. It has echoes in my own experience with music and improvisation, and I sort of understand it through that tension between getting to the personal expression through the discipline. Repetition is another big thing that I was sort of kind of fixated on when I was looking at the art, and it's something that obviously has a lot of meaning to me. Repetition is often kind of undervalued in a lot of classical music, but it's the bread and butter of popular music, of jazz, of all kinds of popular idioms. And it's all about repetition with difference, and I was sort of really drawn to that as well. And we talked a little bit about rhythm too, and yeah, I mean, there's sort of lots of echoes with rhythm and the drops, and then the heads, and particularly something like this where you're sort of traveling from picture to picture and you see variations on it, so, but all this is to say, like you go in and I'm sort of saying, think about the form, think about these structures that the artist is using, but of course it's all to kind of get through to expression, to emotion, to individuality, and one other thing I was thinking about is, I was thinking a lot about that tension, because that's something that I experience when I'm playing music. Is I want to, you're obsessed with like playing the idiom. So I really want to play jazz, and I want to go to a jam session, like be able to play convincingly some in the kind of mainstream jazz idiom of today. And you can do that and still kind of not sound really good, because you really want to kind of create your own sense of yourself, your own sense of who you are through those structures, through that discipline. I don't want to wander too far away, but I guess that's the gist of what I wanted to say. I apologize if it's not like as polished as Ira, which is really great. So anyways, that's sort of my general approach. I don't know, do you have any question? Maybe we could bounce things off, or I don't know.
Well, I mean, Andy, something that sort of occurs to me or that I'm remembering as you're talking is we walked through the gallery and you mentioned a sort of very concrete example of sort of the listener hearing this way that jazz works. Like if you're in the audience and you recognize the motif and you say something like, oh, that's on Green Dolphin Street or whatever.
Oh,
and you experience this pleasure of recognizing
Yeah.
both that the artist is working with something that's sort of a known quantity and yet departing from that. And so you're sort of appreciating his skill in, you know, replicating in a way that's not the best word, but what's already sort of been done, but also being original somehow.
That's right. It's this great. In some ways, jazz today. I mean, let's see. Reference sampling. Well, I had two kind of interrelated thoughts. Well, you know, it's funny. It's you go through the show, and my knowledge of art history is okay, but it's sketchy, and so you know, I see parallels in a kind of visual way that like there was a self-portrait. I think you're stuffing people or figures into your mouth, and it's like, oh, that's like echoes of Goya, and an image I've seen where Saturn devouring his children. And it was, you know, and so it made me think like, oh, the more you know about the references, you don't need to know that, but it gives you a little bit of that. So, you know, you turn on WUSF and they're playing their jazz show or whatever, and you'll know, if you're into the idiom, you'll recognize immediately the tunes when you don't hear the melody, or you hear lots of quotes of other tunes, and I don't know, it makes it sound like, I mean, again, it goes to this tension I'm talking about. It's like, it's not that you like, I would have this very immediate reaction to the music I listened to, but I was always driven to kind of understand it. And the more I tried to understand it, the more I would catch all these references, and it would deepen that experience. So I guess I see lots of parallels that way. And in some ways, it drives me to, you know, when I was actually reading that Mia Mound book that you gave me as like a little reference, and I was like, oh, once I read some of the narratives, some of the stories that you had written, I was like, oh, wait, I kind of I understand that that kind of rainbow color is drawn from some of the Lloyd and the Painter kind of ideas that you had been talking about. And that sort of deepened, I was like, oh, I sort of get it. It's like, there are these structures I've created, and I'm going to work through these structures and kind of like recombine them into new ways. And it's like, you don't necessarily need that narrative, but it suddenly started to change the way I looked at it. And that's ultimately how I approached my academic work, you know. Because when I teach classes, you know, you have to, I do all this stuff. I try to emphasize that you should understand some of the forms and structures of what you're listening to, and you get a lot of this like, you know, you ruined it for me, man. You know, you're ruining the art, man. And they don't really talk like that. That's like, it's like my stoner surfer version of my students. But I don't know. In a way, I feel like I'm making this like really kind of old fogey kind of argument. But yeah.
Go for it.
As I ramble, yeah.
Something that I love jazz, and I know Trent does as well. Something I want to ask you about that you know probably much more than I do is there's a not ending quality to composition making and to the performative aspect. So a John Coltrane standard that he did in 1971 is different than what he did in 1974. And there's this, I don't want to call it transcendent, but there's this idea that you're going in a direction. And there's a drive there that is, the overwhelming fuel of what's driving the musicians, which is not to do that composition once, but to, you know, continue to move it towards something else.
Right. John Coltrane's music had a massive impact in a very short career, and he dies in the mid-60s. But he's sort of iconic in this. I had a professor in grad school, and he called it searching music. You know, like there's a kind of jazz that's sort of this searching music, and Coltrane is like kind of the icon of this. And if you listen, what he'll do is he'll play improvisations on standard structures like the blues or my favorite things, and he'll take little notes, 3 or 4 notes, and he'll just turn those around and almost in a painterly sort of way, like almost sculpturally. Like he'll take this little motive and he'll play it once and he'll play it differently, and he'll change the timbre and he'll change the composition of the relationship of those notes, and it's this sort of obsessive searching thing. And there's a famous story that Miles Davis was famously very laconic when he played, very, I'm just going to play a few notes, kind of boil things down. And I get the famous story, and I'm probably getting it wrong, and it's just a story, so it's probably not even true, but is that Miles said, why do you take such long solos? And John Coltrane said, well, I got a lot to say. And so it's a famous story, kind of illustrates their 2 different approaches, but I don't know, that's immediately what I think of, is, see, not that there's like a direct parallel, but I do see echoes, like we're taking this, from what I've read, this mythology, and you create this world, and you're going to work through this world, and you're going to really going to, maybe, I don't know where I'm going to go, but in recombining and looking at it from different angles and using different media and different approaches to get at something, that kind of searching quality. And I sort of really respond to that. And echoes.
Do we have a question from the audience? Ooh, I'm going to go back there to that woman who raised her hand. Mm-hmm. You?
I'm very curious as to what you think about how the person listening to that, like the audience, or looking at the work, what their response is to these variations on say you're listening to John Coltrane and all of a sudden something from Over the Rainbow, just a bit of it, and then it continues on to something else. And so what do you think that does to the audience? Because I don't think these artists and musicians play just for themselves.
No.
I mean, they're trying to also carry us along.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, music and it's music and art is a fundamentally social activity. I mean, I'm sort of really feel that there is a danger when you're at a museum or you're listening to a record that the music becomes a sort of object. And of course it's not. It's someone made it and you're responding to it. It's sort of living in the moment as you sort of deal with it. It's a sort of social activity. The relationship between the listener, it's funny because my approach was, well, I want to see how the musicians sort of understand it, and that's kind of my obsession. But of course, that's not the only way to listen, and I think artists, musicians, I guess that's one of the challenges, one of the excitements of art is kind of, you have your own set of concerns, your own set of formal issues, of emotional issues that you want to kind of put form to and express, and you want to communicate those too. And without sounding too, I guess, pedantic about it, but it's kind of a dialectic. It's sort of going back and forth, and I think any musician knows that you could play something. Someone might listen to it and not get it the way you understood it, but that doesn't matter to a certain extent. I mean, I think we tend to have this notion of art as like I have a thought and I beam it into your head or something via the music, and it's not like that. And so I don't know. From an academic point, I think what interests me is that that I want to kind of bridge those two. That the musicians have certain concerns, often of a formal nature, an expressive nature, and then there's the audience and how they listen. And that relationship is actually really kind of complicated and rewarding to study. I don't know if that's much of it.
Go ahead, sir.
My question was very similar, variation on the thing with the prior question. It really comes from looking at that sort of iconic shape, where you've got 2 mountains, but within one bigger mountain that's really the same shape. And I guess we're living in a world right now where, we've got this notion of 2 things standing apart from one another taken to its ridiculous extreme, where we've got a dictator who wants to hold on to power and killing his own people. We've got people in high places in public office who become very very stubborn and don't want to listen to anybody else, but they want to just put forth their own message. But they don't step back and see that there are two entities within this broader entity that need to converge. And so that's sort of where my question is coming from. And let me also add, I think this forum is really beautiful and a contradiction of that, because here we have artists who are responding and being inspired by the work of another artist, and then becoming creative from the juices of another artist. And so my question really goes out to Trenton and Ira as well. To what extent do you get into a zone when you become creative that's not based on contours or based on things from yourself, but really do you ever get into a zone where your creativity is sparked by a relationship, by feeling connected to another human being, rather than just your own individual histories? And how does that creativity, how does that differ? How does that reflect in your work?
Okay. Is it is your question related to maybe an artist's responsibility?
Sort of.
Okay. Do you think there's a social responsibility for the artist?
In a way.
Mm-hmm.
So that we're engaged and connected rather than separate.
Okay.
So it's the bigger arch rather than the two arches that stand apart.
So you think there's an obligation to communicate certain things?
Particularly in these times.
Mm-hmm. Well, I do and I don't. And I'd say in graduate school, that's something I wrestled with in terms of how I define what that relationship is with society, with culture. And I think it became a crippling kind of a question and a quandary for myself, in the sense that I just want to make things. And at some point I thought, I was in school in Philadelphia at the time. It's like the city of brotherly love, you know, murals everywhere. It's like the city with the most murals in the whole world, actually. It's like art for the people. You know, it's trying to lift people out of the doldrums, out of this state of, you know, impoverished, you know, this mentality, and to look at these images that were positive. I was like, oh, maybe I should be out there painting murals for the people. And I thought, well, I don't really want to. I have this other investigation I need to. And then I started thinking about, you know, that relationship to another person, whether they're living or dead, happens for me sometimes when I go to a museum or a gallery or something, and I make this connection. And the person may not be there, but through the art or through the music or through the literature, I then make this connection that lifts me out of this place. And it's not about me standing on a soapbox somewhere, preaching like a political stance. I'm not necessarily political in that way, in the way that I think. So, but I can be quite, I can feel radical thoughts within my work, and I can see change happen in my work because it's the only reason I want to go back into the studio. If something has to be changing from day to day, and if the byproduct is that someone else out there sees that, even however it may be not something that I've focused my eye to yet, but that someone else sees that and it changes them, then that is good enough for me.
Ira, did you or Andy want to speak to that question?
I think the whole journey to become a writer started with an investigation of myself first. And I think for any kind of young artist, one has to investigate the self before they can investigate the world. And so when I put pen to paper for that first draft, I close the door. The writers say, you know, I write with the door closed, which is just my thoughts and analyzing, asking questions of myself. to drive, give reason to this piece of this document I'm working on. But once after revision, once I finished it, I opened the door, and that's when all these other cultural concerns come in. Especially from my perspectives, I'm always writing about the perspective of an immigrant son, and finding his place in America. I'm always writing from a place of a fat man trying to find a spot on an airplane or something, right? So automatically these issues become social. They become political. The body has become political. The subject of the body becomes political without me having to say it's political. Once it's out there, it's political. It's social. It's there. But it always starts with, I think it always starts with this personal interrogation first. Before we have to make sense of ourselves before we can make sense of anything else.
We'll have time for more questions at the end, but I want to turn it back to David and Trent now so that we can hear Stacy's comments.
You know, actually, I think that question is a perfect segue for me into something that it's another range of topics, and this is going to take a little bit longer than 5 minutes, but to talk about which have to do with, I think, the process of self-making and the responsibility and the display that Trenton takes on of laying that process literally out, not just in metaphorical terms, through making and displaying the process of making, and through the process of storytelling and of telling of the self and the telling of others, but also literalizing the process and displaying it out for us. And I really believe that it's an act of, it's a political act in what he's doing, because he bears not just the therapeutic aspects of it and the positive aspects of it, but the negative recoil and the fear side of it, and the the parts where connection to other doesn't quite take shape. But that said, something about Trenton's process that we've already talked about that is metaphorically there in the narrative. We talked a little bit in the beginning about the overarching narrative having to do with the two types of characters, mounds and vegans. Mounds being this ever-consumptive force that is able to absorb as much difference as possible. And then the process of digestion, literally, of digesting this absorption and consumption of others and of discarded, low quality and high quality valued objects and images, from pop culture or from high art. And then looking at the production that comes out of this process of digestion. And I want to start by talking with Trent about a performance that happened in 1998. This was Trenton's first solo exhibition, and it happened in Texas. And the exhibition was called Off Colored. And Trent, why don't you describe this performance that you did?
Okay, let's go back to the first image.
Okay.
Let's get to the third image. Okay. Well, this is from 1998. This was my first professional one-person show in a gallery. And I had been discovering, I guess you could say, or excavating these characters in my studio. Didn't quite have names for all of them. I didn't know what they were, but I was feeling them out in two-dimensional form and began to do these performances where I became these characters. And I often say that it was in an effort to believe in the things that I was painting. If I could become the painting or become the character, then I didn't feel so much like a fraud when I went to paint them. So when people came into the gallery, they weren't greeted with, the artist and a champagne glass what they saw was this creature sleeping in the middle of the gallery. And I deprived myself of sleep for several days and took sleeping pills to ensure that, I would, stay asleep. And so every 30 minutes, there we go, an alarm clock would go off, and the director of the gallery would come in and turn on the lights and get up on a ladder and feed me a bowl of Jell-O. And there was 4 different feedings, so every 30 minutes this action would repeat. And let's go back a slide. So the assistant director of the gallery, she was underneath this costume, this outfit, and she was blowing up balloons that corresponded to the color of Jell-O that I had just eaten. So there was 4 different colors of Jell-O. And now I guess you're gonna skip forward. Right there, okay. And then she would shove the balloons out the butthole of the creature. And so these, by the end of the night, there was balloon shit all over the floor. Let's see, is there one more? Okay. And so this is the aftermath without me in the costume. And on the walls are plastic tops, like the tops from water bottles and detergent that I had affixed to the wall. So what was happening on the floor kind of mimicked what was going on the wall. And the whole thing I saw as sort of a dream. Maybe these colors are what this character dreams or how he thinks. It's when I first started to articulate what this character meant to me and what kind of energy that he had. It was kind of a really benevolent kind of an energy, a giving energy, but one that's about consumption. What he gives forth is just this blissful color, but what he takes in could be quite ugly and grotesque. So that character for me became a certain kind of attitude, or me translating a certain attitude I had about life. And so yeah.
Well, I think this work is an excellent example of actually the paintings themselves, which have the residue of the performative action of it, of what you did, and the processing and the digestion of various different forms from different sources, and the processing of those into this funnel of digestion that then becomes something else. And I have one more image that I want to talk about because it's in the show, and it's called Dissension and Dissension. And it has to do also with the mythology that you've continued this metaphor of digestion. And I want to just briefly talk about vegans. And there are 2 types of vegans now, black vegans and white vegans. And they are in conflict. And there was one group of particular black vegans led by Black Beto. Mm-hmm. And he was angry at this other, you tell it so much better, actually.
Okay, yeah, I was like, just where are you going with this? Yeah, I don't know how much about story time you want me to get into, but
brief, just
okay.
To set it up.
So the way I set up this history about veganism and mounds is that these vegan characters are the aggressors usually, and throughout history I've tried to find ways to destroy these mound characters, which for me represent the goodness of the earth. They represent expanding, taking things in, and being this solid constant. And the vegans are sort of like, if I had to break them down into a formal thing, they're able to dissipate and run around in groups, but then they can coagulate and become a solid mob, if you will. And they're, I guess you could say, the bad guys. Well, there was one point in history where there was good vegans, and these good vegans wanted to be friends with mounds. They wanted to bridge this gap between these 2 races and ultimately create one unified thing. And they did this through color. So there were these, vegans are just, they have a white pallor to them. But at some point in this, I say, counter-revolution or whatever you want to call it, these good vegans, out of that group there was a Judas type of a character, and his skin at some point went from a white color to a black color, and he wanted to restore darkness to the underworld, which he created a new race of vegans through a process of smiricalization. And I know it doesn't make any sense, but ultimately he created enough of an army to attack these white characters, and ultimately darkness was restored.
Well, there are two parts about it that I wanted to bring up. Is that one, the vegans, traditional vegans, see only in black and white, and mounds see in full spectrum color, and this group of good vegans, in order to link up and connect with mounds, imbibed mound meat. So they were given permission to gather mound meat, tap it, so to speak, and then they imbibed it as a kind of hallucinogen or transformative element that allowed them to then see in color.
So, in essence, they took a shortcut to humanity. It's like trying to regain this part of them that had been lost through generations, which is their eyesight. It was a sacrilege in taking meat. Vegans aren't supposed to have any kind of meat, but they were like, well, we'll take this mound meat, see, and it acted as a drug. They started seeing colors, and that was their shortcut into this other place. So in a way, I guess that whole story talks about, I don't know, the dangers in, I don't know, I'm not like Nancy Reagan or anything, like don't do drugs, but it's like the danger in maybe not thinking things through, or not stepping back and looking at what's the best path that I should take to get to this end point that I want. And sometimes it's an issue of time. And these guys, they wanted to cut that down to something that was more manageable for them. So they were like, we want to get the desired effect in, well, you know, the least amount of time. It's sort of like the get-rich-quick schemes, or, you know, the crazy weights that you hold in your hand that like shake. Like, you know, you see these goofy commercials for things. It's like, maybe this work was sort of a comment on that. Like,
well, what I really like about it is that you've, in story form and in this kind of narration, this is probably the most narrative painting that we've looked at so far. You have this machine that processes this mound meat, which is the body of somebody else. And there's this digestive process that happens that then ultimately becomes transformative, in the sense that you understand the other and you can relate and connect.
Well, let's hand things over to Stacy Holman Jones, and Stacy, we do have the images that you're sort of specifically talking to.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And thanks to everybody. It's been such a pleasure to listen to the conversation and to also be a part of it. And I guess I'll echo Andy's sentiments. If that was Egghead, now we're really gonna geek out a little bit here.
Let's go.
And the way that I'm coming into the conversation is based on the ideas of performance and performativity in the work, as well as some of the other ideas. And I'm going to ask you to come with me a little bit here, and we're going to use some theoretical ideas as a little bit of a structure and a way to maybe play around with and riff on some of the things that we're seeing in Trent's work. And so in particular today, I thought it might be fun to work with the ideas of performativity as a theoretical construct, as well as a couple of ideas in Julia Kristeva's work, particularly her ideas of the abject and the deject a little bit, and then some really kind of fusion stuff about an ethic of love that I find pretty interesting. But this talk is meant to be playful, and it's meant to be fun and a real pleasurable exploration. So if at any point it doesn't feel very fun, just raise your hand and I'll redirect or move away. Performativity, we like to use that word a lot. It's a really relatively simple theoretical construct. It's the idea that any identity is fashioned, made known to us and understood in the doing or in the performance. So, for example, queer theorist Judith Butler's notion of gender performativity is this: rather than something that's innate or foundational to or essential to us or about us, gender is instead a performance that we enact, engage, repeat, revise in order to accomplish a given identity. So performativity just turns our taken for granted ideas about gender as cause inside out. So we don't cry because we're women, or we don't fight because we're men, but instead, through these repeated and learned performances of emotionality or of aggression, we learn to do our genders. And in turn, we understand what it means to be men or to be a woman. So in other words, gender is an effect rather than a cause of these performances. And so really, that's a simple idea, but what's interesting for me and what's interesting, I think, in the work is how it turns us then to questions of doing, of making selves, creating. And also, interestingly, when it gets really interesting is how violating the norms or the rules or the structures for doing things right, so doing gender right or doing race right or correctly, helps us look at how we construct identities, how we police them, and also at the mutable nature of all this stuff that we think is really natural or taken for granted or that we can't help. So the whole idea is it's fallible, it's changeable, it's mutable. And then we can open up other ways then of seeing things, of telling things, of being in the world. So these violations are both critical and they're constructive, okay? So we can think, for example, about the created or performed nature of identity in Trent's work, It Takes Two. So Trent, in that piece, stands behind Torpedo Boy. So he's simultaneously leaning into and propping him up, right? And he's whispering into his ear. So when I look at this piece, I see Torpedo Boy as both a manifestation of Trent and as separate from him. So he's of him, he is connected to him, and he's also separate from him. The posture and that connection call up and refigure the creation scene in the creation of Adam, with Trenton's right hand stretched out to touch this disembodied white glowing finger in that upper left corner. It's receiving a charge there. And his left hand is clenching that pencil, right? The extension of self, the extension of the means of access to the self, the ways in which that you can sketch a self into being, right? And it's in this really interesting kind of, it's seemingly innocuous place in the work, but that's where the power is happening in the work. So I'm feeling like this work, it tells and critiques an idea of divine creation, that of God and that of the artist. And it offers us a window into identities as selves that we make or that we construct. And as Torpedo Boy's and Trent's full cheek suggests, we sort of breathe life into these identities performatively. And so that piece is sort of a way in. And what I want to do now is, in addition to thinking about how identities are constructed in your work, I'm also interested in how the work critiques and refigures very particular kinds of subject positions, many of which are disgusting, violent, and kind of play with taboos. And this is where the abject gets going. So I want to talk about the abject. We love that word. We like to throw it around, but I want to talk a little bit about what it is, what it means, where it's coming from, and also talk about this really interesting character called the deject, too, which I think is just brilliant in terms of the work. Okay, you ready? Let's go. So Julia Kristeva, as you may know, is a literary theorist. She's kind of a reluctant feminist and a psychoanalyst. And she moved to France from Bulgaria right before the events of May 1968. Okay? And so Roland Barthes, who is her teacher there, characterized her as an outsider and a revolutionary. So she came in and she really shook things up in Paris. And her work, she was really interested in kind of answering or talking back to the diminishing and circumventing of women as other, as lack, as separate from and foreign to language and symbol using and reason. In the psychoanalytic work of Freud and also the psycholinguistic work of Jacques Lacan. Okay, so here's where she is, coming in to mix things up. And her work draws together contradictions of a lot of things. I'm going to make a little laundry list here. Of the unconscious and the conscious, right, because that's the stuff in psychoanalytic theory, inside and outside, kind of mankind or person kind and animal, mother and father, high and low, language and meaning, and she wants to bring these contradictions together and hold them together without resolving them, okay? And I really feel like Trenton's work freely explores those contradictions. It explores these taboo subjects, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about them, conflict, violation, and creates these abject identities and holds those contradictory elements together in process. Kristeva's term is in process and on trial. And they're also really open to change then, to mutability. And so let me say just a smidge more about the abject. So Kristeva, here's the idea. So the move into language that we make as children, okay, and this is also commenting on Lacan's mirror stage when you start to recognize the self in the mirror, and I was really interested in that part of the conversation, mimics that first separation from the body of the mother, as well as a series of visceral and pretty violent rejections and separations that prepare us to constitute selves and identities in the world. Okay, so this is the premise. And one of the first separations that we learn to do this, we learn to create boundaries around, is the separation from ourselves, from our bodies, from the products of our bodies. Okay? So, for example, that process of taking food into the body, digesting it, metabolizing it, and expelling it is a great example of how we make boundaries, how we mark boundaries. And this is explored really vividly in the work, and I was just thrilled to see those photographs of the performance, which I hadn't seen before, because that's an enactment of the work. And it's the enactment of that contrast of the vegans who are cut off, right, from the body and the pleasures and the products of the body, and they eat rarely, and they have this really regimented diet, right? And the mounds, which you said, right, they're just an ultimate contrast. They're these undulating, kind of pulsing omnivores, right? And they are both the sort of source of sustenance and the substance of it. So they kind of embody this contradiction that abjection gets us at. And a couple of the other portraits that Ira was talking about, man don't, work don't eat, right? And we can't have the things we want with that hamburger sort of perpetually suspended away from the body. It's just a quick snapshot into the structures and the struggles of separation that we endure. And so I want to talk about abjection as this way that we police borders, always. So we want to purge the impure, the disgusting, that unwanted parts of ourselves: blood, sweat, excrement, snot, wounds, and then we got to add all the other stuff in: mothers, difference, death, right? All this is a purging process. And in Kristeva's words, we permanently thrust aside all this stuff in order to live. So these are her words. These body fluids, this defilement, this shit are what life withstands hardly and with difficulty on the part of death. There I am at the border of my condition as a living being. And then if we look at the piece, the doorstop, it performs that separation, that elasticity we were saying, and the border of abjections and literally of death. And it is a separation of mind and body. The mother's body, interestingly here, represented by this opening, which is at once a wound in the head and on the body, and also this kind of living, flowering, kind of life-giving element of nature. You know, it's this kind of point of emergence, right, and glowing there. And the work literally imposes a border that disrupts identity and system and order, and then acts that contradiction. It's a very neat and defined border. It's also the pink of mound meat, the pink of the womb and the feminine, and in Kristeva's words, it shows biology showing through the fleshy confines of knowledge and of logic and order, completeness, life, death. And the title of the work really adds a whole lot to the meaning that I'm feeling here, because the doorstop is literally this placeholder that holds open one space from another. You know, it doesn't permit closure. It keeps those things always suspended in conversation, or that mannequin hand peeking out from under the door. And it doesn't, doorstops don't respect borders and positions, right? They keep things in between and ambiguous. And okay, are you still with me? Because this work and the work in general, I think really playfully conjures up Kristeva's notion of an exile or a deject, which she contrasts in some interesting ways with the abject. And I read the deject as a kind of trickster who plays in and around with objection and these ideas. Kristeva says the deject is not without laughter. And he or she is a stray who, and she uses the male pronoun here, so I will, places himself, separates himself, and situates himself instead of fixing a position. And I'm just going to bore you a little bit here. So the deject places himself in and among his abjections. And I love this. Casts within himself the scalpel that carries out the separations. And I really see Trent's collage paintings, where he literally casts himself, his tools, his collected materials, all of the stuff we might characterize as trash or refuse, which is another separation, right? We got to get rid of all that stuff, but here let's bring it into the work. And his possessions, so those odor eaters, right? I mean, it carries the body literally in them, in the work. And so I really saw that playing around with some of that. And Kristeva says the deject is a divisor of territories and of languages. And I'm just gonna, because I just was really excited when I read this, and I thought it said a lot about the work. The deject never stops demarcating his universe, whose fluid confines constantly question his solidity and impel him to start afresh. A tireless builder, the deject is on a journey during the night, the end of which keeps receding, which gets to this idea of repetition. He has a sense of danger, but he can't help taking the risk at the very moment he sets himself apart. And the more he strays, the more he is saved. And okay, are you still with me? Do I still have a second?
Yes.
Now I'm going to go into this sort of jazz fusion dreamy state that I was really interested in exploring. And you can just say if I'm just completely full of it at the end. We'll see. But this idea that you're on some kind of quest and you're taking these risks and you're trying to be saved in some sense by the body or by faith or by, I'm going to say it, love. And I think we get maybe how the sort of political happens in the work here, maybe. I want to talk to you a little bit about Kristeva's idea of an ethics of love. Or to be more precise, really, it's called a heretical ethics of love. And here, heresy really does mean departing from this established, entrenched system of beliefs. So here's the setup. She has an essay where she's talking about the maternal and motherhood, and Kristeva gets kind of a bad rap as this essentialist feminist, and it's all about the woman and the body and these things. And she takes on the cult of the Virgin Mary, and she's dealing with this idea in order to kind of give a little larger read to that story, and also to point out all the ways that it kind of limits us. And so she writes this essay that's originally titled A Heretical Ethics of Love. So that's a kind of backstory. And she's talking about how there's both a separation, so of women from other women, of women from men, mothers and children, right? The sacred and the profane. So there's a separation, but there's also a collapse. So the woman becomes mother. They're one and the same. The human and the divine become one and the same. And at the end of the essay, so she's trying to take on these contradictions and hold them apart and show how they're collapsed and how that does a whole lot of damage to people. She calls for this idea of a feminine ethics or heretics. And here's what it involves. Not avoiding the embarrassing and inevitable problematics of the law, structure, right? Language, reason. So not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, I guess. But instead giving it flesh, language, and jouissance. So for heretical ethics, separated from morality, a heretics is perhaps no more than that which in life makes bonds, thoughts, and therefore the thought of death bearable. So heretics is underneath love. So she really is kind of calling people together to bind together under this idea of love. And that idea comes together for me in Trent's work when I hold two pretty distinct images in the show together in my mind. The first one is the Everlasting Arms, version 2.
We only had a slide of version 1.
Okay, well the painting, I'll just talk, you have to go over now to the cam to see the painting then. So it does contrast these kind of these bony vegan arms, right? They're black and white in the painting, crossed in a position that conjures the corpse, right? A posture of conflict, and also could be seen as some kind of embrace or solidarity and support, right? And then it's packed with these contradictions, the painting is, which I think are the problematics of the law here, that really come together in the whole space of the painting. So there's the hymn of the title and the separations of the arms from the body, right, or the vessel of worship, this soft pink flesh, which is in the background, and that more acid pink in the painting. So they're raindrops, they're cut out, so they could be raindrops or sweat or blood, right? They cut into and disrupt that natural landscape of the painting. And the colorful surfaces of the canvas reveal a darkness underneath. So it's got all the things that we've been talking about today sort of at play. So there's that painting. And then to kind of hold that together in your mind with the painting that we started with, the image that we started with, which is No, I Really Do Love Myself, which is a portrait that's so full of vulnerability and humor and those taboos about what happens if you don't separate the abject from yourself completely or without some kind of sense of humor about it, which I really appreciated and the work that Ira generated. And I really hear Kristeva's words about creating a story that's not founded on a separation or a collapse, but that's founded on flesh, language, and pleasure. And so it separates us from this kind of morality tale of what's natural, what's normal, what's right. And the form here really is literally demarcating that universe whose confines are really very fluid and in question, and performs, I think, how this idea of a heretics of love, or that underneath kind of love, might hold us together through transgression, through revision, through repetition, without any kind of sense of closure or cutting off. So it's this kind of ongoing story. So if I think of those two paintings together and the ways they kind of conjure this idea of a relation, of a relationality that's not premeditated or that's dictated to us or that fills some kind of social role, but instead is more like a conversation, I think we can really get to some kind of place of change. You know, it really holds that open for me. So I had a lot of geeky fun looking at this, and I hope I made some sense.
We're sort of actually almost out of time at this point, but I do want to get to any questions. Let's start specifically with some questions for Stacy, if folks have those, and then as well, general questions. We've got a hand up right here.
I was hoping to hear your insight on Trenton's use of language, because language seems to be so important in our initiation into the fraternal symbolic order that you talked about.
Mm-hmm. And I didn't. I had to sort of slash some stuff out of here, but that some of the ideas that Chris Davis developed about the kind of contrast of the semiotic, which is the body, and the symbolic, which is language, I really see happening in the work. I see it happening in the narrative and the conflict and the contrast between the vegans and the mounds of vegans are the stuff of rationality, of language, of symbol use, of this kind of Lloyd force, and the semiotic is this kind of rhythmic, colorful, you know, kind of more body-driven conversation that happens there. And of course, the ways in which the text happens in the work and the repetition of that and how it comes up against some of these other forces. I was glad we looked at the dissension painting because it really kind of embodies that tension without resolving it, you know, holds it together there. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I really see that happening in the work. So it was really like this light on theory, which can be kind of obtuse, you know. It was like, there it is. I totally see it happening in front of me.
Yeah, you commented to me at one point that it had been uncanny for you to come into contact with the work and sort of also be having these ideas in circulation in your head.
Yeah, and I mean, and I wanted to say too that, you know, I'm at home, got my books, and it's this very private sort of like looking and going, wow, you know, and then so it's a real pleasure to come here and sort of be able to have a conversation about it because it is a very private thing. Theory can be a very private kind of experience, and so it's not any good to us unless we can, you know, use it. It's a tool. You can like bludgeon someone with it, but you can also get these really kind of these really very nice kind of finessed understandings. You know, I hope I didn't bludgeon you with my.
It could be a feather or a bludgeon. Neil.
I guess relating back to the doorstop image, there's this really terrifying nature of the doorstop. And
Yeah.
There's always this potential for boundaries to be crossed.
You're right.
And I guess maybe this is more of a question for Trenton, but related to what you were talking about, which you mentioned to me last night, is there's this since there's always this boundary crossing, there's this cannibalistic nature to your work. Whereas you're taking all this trash and you're reusing it and putting it on new things. And when does that ever end? Like, it's really scary. And I always think of this scene in the Charlie Kaufman movie adaptation where Nicolas Cage is trying to adapt Orchestheat, and all of a sudden he's like, I've written myself into my script. It's stupid. It's sloppy. What the fuck am I doing? Like, do you ever have that kind of fear? Like, is there a boundary to not be crossed? Doorstop that?
Well, I guess that's the real challenge in my studio. It's not like how to paint or anything like that. It's like, well, when in trying to maintain, I guess there's this delusion I have that I know who I am, and I don't. And once I lapse back into that space where I realize that I'm ever changing, my body's changing, things around me are changing, therefore I have to adapt to these things. Things get quite scary. I mean, there's also another component in that I am literally an all-consumptive being. Like, I'm always taking things into my physical space, like collecting objects, and some ways I'm a bit of a hoarder. So it's like, when do actual objects start to overtake me, and how is that changing me, and how do I filter those things into something that I feel is productive? And it's the difference between having artistic inspiration or whatever around me, or just being a crazy person. So I'm always aware of what, that thing. And, and then I think about I watch a lot of movies, and you're talking about Charlie Kaufman and stuff. It's like Reservoir Dogs, Tarantino, a film about losing yourself, and when do you get past that point? So that's in a way, the doorstop. It's like at some point, Tim Roth's, I think is his name, character actually leaves life and enters death, and the movie's beautifully staged because most of it's set in a casket factory. All of the pivotal moments take place right there, and at that moment, he's a zombie. He's already dead, even though he's still alive. And so for me, that kind of thing, that's what the doorstop is. It's like the living dead, it's kind of this thing.
Well, I think we actually have to conclude there in terms of time. It is noon. So thank you, everyone, for your attention and for joining us.